Speaking Freely, Unlearning the Lies of the Father's Tongues by Julia Penelope. A note to listeners from me, the reader. There's a list of abbreviations here, which I'm going to unabbreviate when I read them. There's also, in the note to readers, a clarification that there's capitals, which mean things, which I'll try to indicate with my voice, and there's asterisks, which mean things, which I'll indicate by snapping. So, here we go. A note to readers. In addition to the abbreviations identified in the preceding list, I use a few typographical conventions with which my readers may not be familiar, and I explain them here in order to facilitate reading this book. In linguistics, the object of study is language. Because we must use language to describe itself, linguists use a variety of typographical conventions to distinguish ordinary language use from metalanguage, language that describes language. I have avoided abstract symbols except in those cases when frequent repetition suggested a symbol would be more economical, for instance, NP for noun phrase. In order to distinguish ordinary uses of words and sentences in communication, linguists italicize words and phrases being analyzed. I use single quotation marks to identify the meaning, reference, sense, or definition of a word or phrase. Conceptual metaphors, because they are abstract representations, are capitalized to distinguish them from the metaphors that occur in language use. For example, argument is war is a metaphorical concept. When we say, that's an indefensible position, we've used a metaphor based on the metaphorical concept, argument is war. In this book, I've followed linguistic convention and used the asterisk to represent two different pieces of information. One, to indicate to readers that, in my judgment, a given word, phrase, or sentence doesn't occur in a language. For example, career man. Women this walked from up gleefully. Two, to mark a proto, that is, reconstructed form for a language. For example, Gwen, woman, scare, to cut, separate, sift. The conventions that govern capitalization weren't always as rigidly codified as we know them today, and I have elected not to capitalize proper names I was taught to capitalize, for example, US, UN, the names of countries, and I capitalize words my readers may not expect to find capitalized, such as feminist and lesbian. I decided whether or not to capitalize specific words on the basis of the importance I attach to the named institutions and objects. Because I consider national boundaries as artifacts of male dominance and control, the first letters in names of countries are lowercase. Because feminists and lesbians are important to me, the first letters of those words are capitalized. Christianity, which I regard as an irredeemable patriarchal institution, is spelled Xtianity. Introduction. I remember a desperately hopeful incantation from my childhood that I used when other children taunted me. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That chant, lodged in my childhood memory, asserts one of the primary dogmas of the patriarchal universe of discourse. Words, language, aren't important. But the words of cruel children did hurt me, however much I wished that they didn't. However much I denied my pain, their vicious words wounded me and left scars that even now throb and smart when I think about them. White men benefit directly when we believe their words are harmless. Understanding how the structure of English controls the way we think and act is crucial to our welfare. What we say is not an insignificant issue. Neither are the words we hear. Words do hurt us. The N-word, fatty, wop, the K-word, the S-word, crip, porker, bird legs, queer, carve emotional wounds that don't heal. The point of these insults is clear. Anyone who isn't white, Anglo-Saxon, thin, and stereotypically attractive is fair game for the stupid and vicious. Other words used by men to insult other men, motherfucker, son of a bitch, bastard, sissy, and cunt, insult men because they're female words. A motherfucker fucks his mother. A bastard doesn't know who his father was, so his mother is a whore. A sissy is a male who acts like a woman. Because being a woman is the worst thing men can think of, we are most accessible to insult and the basis of men's worst insults. Words hurt us, but languages are much more than the words in their vocabularies. They are systems of rules, rules which speakers find useful for saying what they want to say. When speakers cease to find rules or words useful, they abandon them and make up new ones. In general, women aren't speakers in the patriarchal universe of discourse, or PUD. We may speak English, but men rarely feel that what we say is worth listening to. Certainly our words are forgotten as quickly as they're uttered or written down, historical ephemera buried under men's debris. Indeed, the language itself is hostile to women's perceptions and thinking. An entire subset of the verbs that describe talk characterizes women's speech as insignificant and worthless. Chatter, prattle, gossip, nag, wheedle, babble, chat, prate, natter, gush, cackle, blather, dither, blab, blabber, gibber, jabber. Used as nouns, these verbs are often modified by harebrained or empty-headed, as though to emphasize the disregard they indicate. English does more than hinder and hurt women. It prescribes the boundaries of the lives we might imagine and will ourselves to live. The many ways the language obstructs our ability to conceive of ourselves as agents in the world or as capable of rebelling against male tyranny go beyond mere hurt to emotional, intellectual, and physical immobility that keeps us men's easy prey. We find it difficult to think outside of the categorical grooves made by men, and even as we learn the courage and the necessity of speaking for ourselves, our thoughts still conform to the structures that perpetuate male dominance. Even as we demand the right to live and breathe independent of men and their dependence on us, our ideas slip into the grooves worn by repetition. The record plays: mother, slave, housewife, slave, child, slave, woman, slave, whore, slave, slave, slave. What's more, most women remain mostly unconscious of how English forces us to repeat the structures that deny us stature and agency in the world, and of the role of language in our oppression. Thinking about how we think is hard. The glamour of grammar. I have thought long and hard about the ways English circumscribes women's lives, leading us to ponder cosmetics while men plan Star Wars and their conquest of the cosmos. One of my purposes in speaking freely has been to expose how men control the way we think about language in general and English in particular. The first 4 chapters describe the male tradition of prescriptive grammars and the patriarchal metaphors on which their descriptions of English are based. Language is a container, language is a woman, and language is a tool. For the title of Chapter 1, I have used the title of an essay by Jane Caputi, The Glamour of Grammar, 1977. To alert my readers to the long-standing philosophical, ideological, and political connections between misogyny, hatred of women, and patriarchal descriptions of English. Although the words grammar and grammariae found their way into English by different routes, both terms were borrowed from Latin sources. Grammar was borrowed from Latin grammatica, the study of letters, from Greek grammatikae. At a later date, grammariae, meaning occult learning, and magic, was borrowed from French grammaire, Old French grimoire, book of magic. The novelist Sir Walter Scott is credited with bringing the Scottish glamour, magic spell with L instead of R, into wide literary use, and etymologists attribute Scott's dialectical variation to a medieval Latin term, glomeria. The borrowing of 2 distinct, if related, words to refer to a collection of rules restricting language use, grammar, and a book of magic, grammariae, may appear to be coincidental. Coincidence or not, the etymological relationship between these 2 words is but one indication of a pervasive way of thinking in English-speaking patriarchies. Men perceive both language and women as property that they have the right to control and restrain, and the obligation to protect. Men's grammatical rules prescribe good English, just as their social rules prescribe the behaviors of good women. During the Burning Time, a period spanning roughly 3 centuries and known in patriarchal histories as the Renaissance, hundreds of thousands, even millions of women were tortured, beaten, and burned at the stake because, their accusers said, they were witches with the power to cast glamours. These glamours, or magic spells, the inquisitors said, caused the genitalia of men to disappear, unmanning them and rendering them impotent, powerless. While women were being tortured and burned alive, male clerics and scholars were writing the earliest grammars of the English language, seeking thereby to fix and standardize its proper usage for all time. Their arrogance is exposed when one realizes that the rules of patriarchal English are glamours, made-up rules said to describe the language that are in fact illusions conjured up by men's ideas of how the language ought to behave. White men's grammars of English have successfully glamorized the way all speakers of English think and use the language every day of their lives. Like the finery of the fairy tale emperor's new clothes, their rules are insubstantial and illusory. In speaking freely, I have focused on how English promotes and maintains woman-hating in the U.S., but readers should bear in mind that the development of standard English is founded in elitism and Anglo-ethnocentricity as well. I cannot demonstrate here the structural integrity of the many dialects of English, such as Black English, or those of mountain people in southern states. But linguists have done huge quantities of research on regional, social, and ethnic varieties of English, and I hope my readers will use this book as a starting point to pursue these connections for themselves. Prescriptive grammarians created Standard English, then promoted it as the only correct, that is, valid, version of English. The story of English is intertwined with misogyny, elitism, and racism. Prescriptive grammar has served white men's purposes for centuries, and its rules have been used to keep economic and social power beyond the reach of the poor and working classes. The English language, accompanied by men's grammars, has also been an instrument of white imperialism, used to destroy the cultures of Native Americans and impose Caucasian values and mores on conquered peoples. This linguistic colonization continues. As I write, there is a growing movement in the U.S. whose proponents are introducing state laws to make English the official language in order to restrict the social mobility of immigrants who don't yet speak English and keep them out of the workforce. Some states, in fact, have already enacted such laws. My discussions of the history of English and the prescriptive grammars devoted to maintaining its mythical purity are intended to alert readers to the intellectual corruption of the prescriptive grammatical tradition and the stubborn bigotry of its proponents. The long tradition of this misbegotten ignorance and the errors of fact, logic, and reasoning propagated by it would be laughable if millions of us hadn't been subjected to the dedication of its practitioners for the last 2 centuries. Like the con men in The Emperor's New Clothes, white male grammarians have claimed to fashion rules that garb English in articulate and precise grandeur, and, in spite of our inability to perceive how those rules serve any purpose, like the timid crowd cheering the Emperor's good taste, we pay lip service to their existence. The Emperor's New Clothes. Speakers of English continue to pretend that Standard English exists, and praise those who claim to speak it for their linguistic finery, although it doesn't exist. We strain to find meaning in nonsensical utterances, as though the presence of recognizable words promised intelligibility. The author of the following quotation, for example, was elected to 2 consecutive terms as President of the United States and in 1989 knighted by Elizabeth II. The other day, when a major bank in New York, Manufacturers Hanover, reduced interest rates, I thought it was very interesting that the man in charge said that they were reducing them because of a feeling of public obligation that so much of our present problem is psychological. And I think it is. And I think some of what's going on in Congress has held back the psychology change that's needed. And this is why I believe, in addition to the constitutional amendment being a very practical way of getting us out of a situation that has seen us have deficits in 19 of the last 20 years, would be the psychological effect that would indicate that the government is really determined to end this kind of runaway spending and have some fiscal integrity and common sense. Ronald Reagan, transcript of press conference, New York Times, July 29, 1982. The problems with Reagan's use of English go beyond the obvious. Rambling, disjointed, incoherent. What is the connection we're supposed to make between public obligation and psychology change? What could psychology change mean? That utterance was brought to us by the same man who gave us "mistakes were made," who lied to us as regularly as he took naps, revealed just how much garbage U.S. voters will tolerate, and left behind a legacy of simple-minded solutions. Just say no to drugs. The trickle-down theory of economics, a budget deficit that future generations will be trying to pay off, and government corruption we may never fully know the extent of. This example is not atypical of what passes for meaning in this society. We hear and read language like his all the time. Only our complicity in this pretense made it possible for the media to label Ronald Reagan the great communicator without derisive murmurs. Why wasn't everyone laughing out loud? The media subject us daily to similarly garbed utterances of the powerful. What authority supports and perpetuates the linguistic etiquette known as Standard English and convinces us along the way to maintain the pretense? There are 3 identifiable sources that make accepting the statement, "that's the way it is," seem easier than trying to expose its falsehood. 2 of them are institutionalized supports. 1, the 400-year-old tradition of male-created grammars and the erroneous ideas about English they perpetuate. 2, public school systems, and the grammar books those school systems persist in buying. There is hardly anyone to challenge that grammatical tradition, because a 3rd source of complicity resides in the mind of every adult who learned Standard English as a child and believes that somewhere out there is a flawless, pure dialect of English known only to a small literary elite, a superior dialect that will open the door to wealth, status, and prestige if only they can learn it. We agree and subscribe to the lie because we think we can make it work for us, not against us. Those of us forced to memorize the rules set out in prescriptive grammars may recall our resistance to what seemed arbitrary and illogical, may remember asking a teacher, "Why can't I end a sentence with a preposition?" or "What's wrong with saying ain't?" We may even have expected approval or acclaim for these exercises in logical perspicacity, and were rudely surprised when the teacher's response was less than informative. "Because I say so. That's the way it is. Because that's what the book says." As adults, we shrink from the word grammar as we shrank from exposing our alleged linguistic inadequacies as children. Too often, our own linguistic perceptions about English were ridiculed and labeled wrong, incorrect, and substandard. Our memories of childhood grammar lessons make us uncertain and inarticulate about a behavior that lies at the center of our lives: speech. Added to our childhood list of don'ts and nevers were a host of grammatical errors that might issue from our lips at any time. We never knew when we spoke which of these invisible creatures might slip out and sabotage our efforts to communicate. Those grammar lessons put in place a judgmental gatekeeper who determines the worthiness of our speech before we dare to open our mouths. Correct, incorrect, right, wrong, the gatekeeper intones as we try to organize our ideas. The resulting damage to our self-esteem is inestimable. Language is essential to our lives, in work, in relationships. It is an important factor in how we perceive ourselves. In the private sphere, we feel uncertain about our ability to communicate clearly. That lack of confidence permeates the fabric of our social interactions. In the public sphere, powerful white men use the media to bombard us with lies, distortions, and nonsense, and, with rare exceptions, their uses of English go unchallenged. If we doubt our perceptions about the language we hear and speak every day, who among us has the daring to cry, "The emperor has no clothes"? Fiction is more palatable than fact. Year after year, teachers inform another generation of students that the arbitrary rules of standard English will determine the kind of jobs they'll get and how well they'll live. They tell children that they must learn to talk right if they want other people to take them seriously. They force us to abandon the dialects, creoles, and other sub- or non-standard varieties of English we speak, substituting standard English, alleged to be the only correct and acceptable way of speaking and writing. They drill their hapless charges week after week, year after year, in the proper forms of the so-called irregular verbs, a misnomer. The written distinction between the possessive its and the contracted it'(s). The difference between the nominative I and the objective me. Never say, "It's me." Linguistic deviance is discouraged and condemned by a prescriptive system of grammatical rules created by several generations of educated Englishmen. The name prescriptive grammar may be unfamiliar, but the existence of its rules probably isn't. It's what teachers continue to teach as the grammar of English, standard English, a collection of grammatical do's and don'ts, arbitrary rules that dictate the social etiquette of language use. It is a grammar of white English, yet its rules misdescribe the structural properties even of that dialect, e.g., never end a sentence with a preposition. Ignore the historical development of the language, e.g., rules regarding the correct form of a verb's past participle, brang versus brought. Warn us away from stylistic infelicities, like dangling participles, ambiguous readings made possible by structural properties of the language, or forbid dialectical constructions, like ain't, y'all, and use, that fill structural gaps. Some of these rules were made up, for example. Never use double negatives, two negatives make a positive. These aren't rules that describe inherent properties of the English language. They are normative rules of usage that reflect and perpetuate what men have thought the English language ought to be, not how it is or has ever been. English teachers assure us that standard white English is the social sorter that determines who will rise up in the social hierarchy and who will not, and they continue to use this claim to justify imposing white English on African American speakers and other ethnic groups. But we know they lie. We know from our experience that standard English is an excuse for denying those of us who aren't white or men or both access to wealth and social mobility. We know from our experience that white men, regardless of how they speak, can rise above us, however pitiful their intellectual prowess, however meager their linguistic resources. Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter, for example, both former presidents of the U.S., acquired tremendous political power and social prestige, yet both spoke substandard Southern dialects stereotypically associated with ignorance and bigotry. Shirley Chisholm, in contrast, an articulate presidential candidate known for her political integrity, was never considered a serious threat to male hegemony because of her sex and race. In spite of her command of standard English, Chisholm didn't have the credentials to be president. She wasn't white, and she wasn't male. If so many people know that standard English is a lie, why haven't we risen up, exposed that linguistic hoax, and refused to go along with it? Because those responsible for our linguistic training have made us feel incompetent and powerless, forcing us to learn their false version of English and abandon our own social, ethnic, and regional dialects, using the promise of upward mobility to herd us into linguistic conformity. The irony of my preceding discussion has probably not been lost to my readers. It is well known that women excel in the study of prescriptive grammars. We learn those false rules much faster than our male peers, and we learn them well. In Language, Its Nature, Development, and Origin, 1921, the Danish linguist Otto Jespersen observed, "Woman is linguistically quicker than man, quicker to learn, quicker to hear, and quicker to answer. If we are more articulate than men, men are linguistically slower than women." Granting this, however, Jespersen didn't hesitate to turn men's inferiority into a plus for them. Quote, "A man is slower, he hesitates, he chews the cud to make sure of the taste of words, and thereby comes to discover similarities with and differences from other words, both in sound and sense, thus preparing himself for the appropriate use of the fittest noun or adjective." There's no way we can win the patriarchal grammar game. Women may be fast learners, for example, but men, because they are slow, remain linguistically dominant. The social construction of sex differences supports male dominance, and our well-attested linguistic superiority becomes yet another bit of evidence of our inferiority. Men have used our alleged linguistic conservatism against us. In other words, our ability to use the rules of languages they've developed, at least since Cicero, who, describing his mother-in-law's speech, said, "It is more natural for women to keep the old language uncorrupted." Jespersen, less certain that women are more resistant to linguistic change than men, nevertheless claimed that, quote, "Women move preferably in the central field of language, avoiding everything that is out of the way or bizarre, while men will often either coin new words or expressions or take up old-fashioned ones, if by that means they are enabled, or think they are enabled, to find a more adequate or precise expression for their thoughts. Woman, as a rule, follows the main road of language, where man is often inclined to turn aside into a narrow footpath or even to strike out a new path for himself. By this clever turn, the linguistic abilities of women are made a fault, and we are stripped of our linguistic creativity by the conceptual dipsy-doodles of male logic. If women speak standard English, we're unimaginative and stupid. If we don't, we're sluts as well. Male ineptitude becomes, as usual, a virtue. Women are so good at prescriptive grammar that we enter college, major in English education, and go out into the public schools to perpetuate good English, as male grammarians have formulated it. For learning men's rules better than they, female English teachers have been caricatured by male linguists as the stereotype of linguistic evil, misfittage. Misfittage, according to male linguists, is responsible for stifling the linguistic creativity of generations of little boys. It's mean misfittage who coerces and browbeats them into learning the rules of prescriptive grammar, fails them for misspelling words, chastises them for saying ain't, and makes their lives miserable, because she polices their use of English. Not only are we not rich or powerful because of our control of standard English, but men ridicule and make us culpable for our complicity in perpetuating and enforcing the rules that keep us in our place. In what Mary Daly calls a patriarchal reversal, men make women responsible for the rules of prescriptive grammar, as though we made up the rules, viciously ridicule us for practicing and teaching the rules, and whine about how hard we make their lives. Trying to follow the twists and turns of male thought is confusing. One fact, however, stands out from their contradictions: the reality of male power. That, and their determination to exercise it at any cost, including extermination of the species. The Cosmetic Universe of Discourse, or CUD. The issue, simply stated, is power. Who has it and who doesn't? Men do the things they do to protect their territory. The boundaries are sometimes shifting and fuzzy, but men will defend to the death every square inch of what they believe they own. In this conflict, control of language is the crucial weapon white men must keep from their enemies, because it is the first and most important method for internalizing oppression in the minds of those they oppress. Language is an intangible, almost invisible weapon. Its messages are implanted in our minds when we are babies, and left there to maintain our allegiance to men and their institutions. If the oppressed are convinced that we deserve to be oppressed and can hope for nothing better, the oppressor's work is done with only an occasional show of power. A Norwegian psycholinguist, Rolv M. Blacher, interested in identifying how language functions as a means of social power, conducted a variety of tests to analyze the complex relationship between social reality and language, 1975. He found that language is not only not a neutral tool, but that it serves the interests and perspectives of those in power, men, at the expense of women. Blacker, citing Robin Lakoff's Language and Woman's Place, 1975, observed that her analysis focused on answers to two different questions. 1. How do women speak English? And 2. How do men talk about women in English? Lakoff herself considered her purpose as trying, quote, to see what we can learn about the way women view themselves and everyone's assumptions about the nature and role of women from the use of language in our culture, that is to say, the language used by and about women. Both of Lakoff's questions, and the answers to them, assume a patriarchal frame of reference. That is, Lakoff assumes that all women speak the same self-demeaning dialect, when in fact it is only those who want to please men who speak in ways that signal their submission to male dominance. Likewise, it isn't only what men say about women that reveals their hatred of us and their certainty that we are innately inferior to them. Men's perceptions of women structure the semantics of the vocabulary itself. Lakoff's way of stating her questions assumed that all women speak differently from men, and that the misogyny of English is confined to a small portion of the language. Neither is true. In Man-Made Language, 1980, Dale Spender observed that many scholars have accepted Jesperson's claims about women's language without questioning or challenging them, citing in particular Robin Lakoff's book and Mary Ritchie Key's less cited Male/Female Language, 1975. Following Jesperson, 1921, both Key and R. Lakoff take men's speech as the neutral dialect and describe how women's speech deviates from that norm. These stereotypical features of women's speech typify the cosmetic universe of discourse, or CUD, a dialect some women use, and only in specific contexts, to signal recognition and acceptance of their subordinate status. I have condensed and arranged these deviations here by linguistic level. Phonological. 1. Women habitually speak at a higher pitch than men. 2. Women use the highest pitch more often than men. 3. Women hesitate or pause more frequently when they talk than men do. 4. Women use the rising intonation that marks questions when they're making statements. 5. Women use emphatic surprise intonation more than men do. 6. Women's speech is more careful and conservative than men's, e.g., women say ing in verbs like playing, saying. Men say n, as in playin' and sayin'. Morphology and word choice. 1. Women's vocabulary reflects their interests: fashion, housework, child-rearing, sewing, cooking, and women make finer distinctions and have more words than men do to talk about colors. 2. Women use a lot of empty or complementary adjectives, such as divine, charming, adorable, exquisite, precious, sweet, and cute. 3. Women use more modals, could, might, would, than men, indicating uncertainty and tentativeness. 4. Women's speech contains more hedges than men's, e.g., well, sorta, kinda, and you know, which indicate that the speaker isn't sure about what she's asserting. 5. Women use more intensifiers than men, which signal intense feelings, e.g., so, such, so much, and quite, as in, I had such a good time tonight, or spending time with you was so exciting. Syntax. 1. Women use fewer imperatives than men do, substituting more polite forms. A woman would say, would you mind closing the window, or would you please bring me another beer? Where a man might say, shut the window, or bring me a beer. 2. Robin Lakoff was the first to claim that women use more tag questions than men. Tag questions are attached to statements to dilute the force of an assertion and to make it appear that the hearer's approval is being sought. A woman might say, that was a good dinner, wasn't it? But a man would say, that was a good dinner, omitting the tag. 3. Women's sentences tend to be longer than men's. Where a man would announce, I'm going bowling, a woman might say, if it's okay with you, I think I'll stop by the bowling alley later tonight. Semantics. There are no semantic traits unique to women's speech. These characteristics of women's speech patterns in English describe the CUD stereotype. Women are said to use intonations, words, and sentence structures that are servile and submissive, or polite, tentative, uncertain, emotionally exaggerated, and self-demeaning. We are said to avoid aggressive ways of speaking, such as imperatives, unqualified assertions, cursing, and brusqueness. More generally, we are accused of talking more than men, talking at great length about trivial subjects, and of being more linguistically conservative than men, and therefore less creative. These alleged traits represent a stereotype of how women talk, not the way we do talk. Some women use some of these signals, for example, high pitch, question intonation for statements, only in some contexts, yet the stereotype persists in spite of research that documents its inaccuracy. One might note, for example, that Jesperson's evidence that women use more intensifiers than men came from the descriptions of how women talk in novels written by men. Similarly, it's not at all clear that tag questions necessarily signal a speaker's submission, and R. Lakoff's assertion that women use more tag questions than men has been challenged on several grounds, among them the fact that male academics often use tag questions, and parents of both sexes use tag questions to address observations to children, e.g., "It's raining, isn't it? Those are monkeys, aren't they?" Tag questions carry with them a patronizing, superior tone, as though the individual so addressed should be grateful to be acknowledged. How English speakers use and interpret tag questions seems to vary with the relative power among the participants assumed to exist in a speech context. Any stereotype gains its credibility from those members of the target group who pretend to believe it. There is that minute grain of truth in men's descriptions of our speech that allows them to perpetuate it in spite of all the evidence that contradicts it. Many women do hesitate when they speak. They use polite forms. Sometimes they qualify and overqualify assertions. CUD is a protective verbal facade, a means of self-defense, however inadequate. Many women still believe that men will treat them kindly if they're good girls, and good girls speak softly, if at all, never raise their voices, carefully couch every assertion with hedges and qualifications, and keep smiling. In like fashion, many women who've been married for many years develop a non-stop way of talking, as though to ward off any attempt to interrupt them, loosing swarms of words that crowd the air, sentences that loop and double back on themselves, the end contradicting the beginning. Still, describing only those contexts in which women do fall back on the CUD stereotype and ignoring every other way women use English perpetuates the idea that the stereotype is accurate and fails to expose its partiality and descriptive inaccuracy. A popular falsehood about women's use of language describes us as the talkative sex. In fact, men occupy verbal space just as they physically occupy every other kind of space, and women who talk stereotypically do so because their words provide them with a protective cover, a verbal wall, to keep men from interrupting them. Pamela Fishman, 1978 and 80, and Weston Zimmerman, 1975 and 83, identified the linguistic methods men use to dominate and control the topic and direction of mixed-sex conversations among whites. Their research contradicted the popular notion that white women talk too much or all the time, revealing that we not only talk less than men, but that most of our part in mixed-sex conversations is supportive, encouraging men to talk. Fishman, for example, taped the at-home conversations of several heterosexual dyads and found that women kept conversations going, suggesting and abandoning potential topics until they found one that the men were interested in, at which point the men assumed control of the conversations. West and Zimmerman's research concentrated on interruptive patterns in conversation, and they found that men interrupt women an average of 3 times more than women interrupt men in a variety of relationships, ranging from unacquainted to intimate. Men not only talk more than women, they drown us out. What emerges from the work summarized here is less than clear. On the one hand, some of the features associated with women's speech reflect the limitations of our experiential domain under patriarchy, the home. For example, women's use of language avoids much male slang, what linguists call conservative, because those who still spend most of their lives within dwellings speak to only a few men and so have little need to imitate the linguistic fads of the man's world. On the other, the evidence for what is put forth as the stereotype of women's dialect remains dubious. Although men typically portray us as talking the way they believe we do, few women actually speak according to the CUD stereotype, as the cheerleaders for the Dallas Cowboys must. The validity of the stereotype itself is more suspect when we realize that studies carried out during the past 15 years expose the stereotype of women talk too much as a reversal of what actually occurs in conversation between women and men. Dale Spender is eloquent on this point. She opens her discussion of Who Does the Talking, 1980, with a few typical sayings about women's volubility, for example, from Scotland. "Nothing is so unnatural as a talkative man or a quiet woman," Swacker, 1975. Followed by quotations from contemporary etiquette books indicating that, in fact, it's men who talk all the time and enjoy doing so. Spender notes the obvious contradiction. On the one hand, we have a society which believes that women are the talkative sex, and on the other hand, we have overwhelming evidence that it is men who do the talking. How, she asks, do we explain the continued existence of this belief? Spender's answer begins by examining the phrase, "women talk too much," paying particular attention to the measurement implied by too much. The concept of women as the talkative sex involves a comparison. They must talk too much against some sort of standard or yardstick, and we have erroneously assumed that the measurement of women as talkers is in comparison to men. But this appears not to be the case. The talkativeness of women has been gauged in comparison not with men, but with silence. Women have not been judged on the grounds of whether they talk more than men, but on whether they talk more than silent women. When silence is the desired state for women, and I suggest that it is in a patriarchal order, as do numerous other feminists, then any talk in which a woman engages can be too much. Spender goes on to ask why there is so little research of the kind done by West and Zimmerman, yet so much on finding the deficiencies in women's words, pronunciation, and pitch. An important question too easily ignored. Spender's answer is clear and succinct. Quote, "The answer lies in the patriarchal order and the beliefs which are necessary for the maintenance of that order. It is important to substantiate women's linguistic deficiencies, and it is necessary to preserve some of the myths upon which those deficiencies depend. That the deficiencies are not found can be explained by the suggestion that researchers have been looking in the wrong place. A new segment is chosen for attention, but the assumption persists. This is not the case with studies on amount of talk. The excessive talkativeness of women is readily exposed as a myth, with the result that many awkward questions are raised. True, exposing the myth of women's talkativeness for what it is might raise many awkward questions. But for whom? The patriarchal notions that women talk too much and that the best woman is a silent woman continue to be played and replayed in the male-dominated media, while the research that calls those notions into question is persistently ignored. Only the few scholars who read the literature know that awkward questions have been raised, and to date they have been collectively unable to dislodge such ideas from the minds of those who would probably hold on to them, regardless of how much evidence contradicted their cherished beliefs. Regarding the question of how men, and many women, persist in believing that women are the talkative sex, Cheris-Krameray's terse summation supplies the missing standard of measurement implied by too much. Perhaps a talkative woman is one who talks as much as a man. 1975. History will teach us, if nothing else, that facts have a hard time when they contradict belief and prejudice, folk theories of how the world is. Facts that would endanger the internal coherence of PUD, patriarchal universe of discourse, are conveniently ignored or, in those rare instances when they become publicly visible, quickly buried and forgotten. Pamela Fishman, 1983, opened her article on the conversational shit work women do with a brief discussion of the social processes at work in the suppression of dangerous information. Citing Berger and Luckman, 1967, she said, "They define power as a question of potentially conflicting definitions of reality. That of the most powerful will be made to stick. Imposing one's will can be much more than forcing someone else to do something. Power may also involve the ability to impose one's definitions of what is possible, what is right, what is rational, what is real. Power is a product of human activities, just as the activities are themselves products of the power relations in the socio-economic world. We are not dealing here with the vague abstraction so often invoked for causal blame, society. Society does nothing. Whatever occurs within a culture is the direct result of human actions. In patriarchy, events and situations are caused by those who have the social, economic, and political power to make them happen, men. In the US, it is white men who have the power to impose their definition of what is real. And because it serves their purposes to do so, they perpetuate their myths about women and language. Under the circumstances, it makes sense. Why would they want to nurture and propound ideas that would undoubtedly raise awkward questions if enough people knew about them? To my readers who shy away from such generalizations, those who will say, no, it's not all men, I agree. Women as well as men pay lip service to the preferred dialect of PUD. Some women certainly do perpetuate the CUD stereotype of women's speech, but only, I suspect, on television. Indeed, some women speak men's language by their rules and excel at it, when men allow them to. For example, Jean Kirkpatrick, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. There are women who are contented with their place in patriarchy, and they are welcome to it. However, those of us who aren't satisfied, who want better lives than we were taught to expect, must stop honoring the rules of PUD. I know some readers will think me unkind to men, and I don't want to be misinterpreted. Yes, a few men are as committed as I to halting the proliferation of doublespeak, garble, and lies that has become our standard linguistic fare. Finally, though, men are the only beneficiaries of PUD, and if I am judged unkind for telling the truth about English and how it maintains male dominance, so be it. The patriarchal universe of discourse. Analyzing a language, especially English, and opening up its vocabulary and internal structure to examination also raises questions about the culture in which that language is a primary means of communicating. Virtually every known society is patriarchal, but each language maintains male dominance in different ways. English has no singular generic pronoun except for one, similar to French un, and most U.S. speakers avoid using it because it sounds stiff or formal. The plural pronoun they certainly does serve as a generic, but prescriptive grammarians continue to condemn its use. Japanese didn't have a passive structure until it was borrowed from English after World War II, but Japanese culture was and is patriarchal. The interconnectedness of language and culture accounts for the way white men guard English, and their squeamish defensiveness whenever women voice our dissatisfaction with the language or the grammars of it men have prepared. There is no doubt that women have, from time to time, challenged the ways male social dominance has been incorporated into the structure of English, but even prodigious research has managed to recover only a few of their names and less of their work. Men continue to have predictable success at burying and erasing women's words, and the process continues. I say a few because until recently, most women have been unable to say what they thought in the publicly accessible media. Women who do manage to find a publisher may write and write, but little of their work lasts because it is pushed off the shelves and into the remainder bins as quickly as possible, in those cases where the words have appeared as a book. Other ways of publishing have an even shorter life. Women's work is buried so quickly that we end up saying the same things over and over, retracing our first conceptual steps out of patriarchy and unable to proceed further. Men drown us out in every medium. Men have put forth many reasons for our inability to establish ourselves visibly and permanently in the public consciousness. We don't know how to write, what we say isn't worth preserving, or doesn't have broad appeal. No one is interested in women's issues. We're too strident, angry, narrow, man-hating, paranoid, rude, ugly, fat. Fill in your favorite adjective. But all of them boil down to one. Men don't want to listen to what we have to say. They don't care what we think when we contradict their pet ideas. No matter how many obstacles we overcome in order to be heard, our words are buried beneath the general male cacophony. Feminists have developed, again, a thorough analysis of what it means to live under white male patriarchy. What does it mean, though, to say the language is patriarchal? Patriarchal language is developed to express the concepts, values, and assumptions of cultures ruled by men. The specific linguistic reflexes of male domination differ from language to language, as my discussions in chapters 5, 6, and 7 illustrate, but they share fundamental characteristics. 1. Phonologically. Intonation, pitch, press, and pronunciation distinguish a woman's dialect from that of men. 2. Morphologically. Women are forbidden to use certain forms of words, to speak words containing the names of male relatives, or may have to add prefixes or suffixes that mean female speaker. 3. Syntactically. A. Women use structures marked as submissive, questions, men use imperatives and assertions. B. Syntactic structures called impersonal are used to describe the world as men perceive it, and these descriptions are accepted as consensus reality. 4. Semantically. A. The vocabulary is divided on the basis of sex-specific experiential spheres. Women occupy the interior space of dwellings, the rest of the world is male. B. The male sex is the unmarked human norm, women are marked as other, or not male. C. Words that are female-specific, including kinship terms, pejorate. They develop negative connotations, usually sexual in nature, and become insults. Words referring to men are valued positively, and there are few, if any, male-specific insults. D. Most generic terms, those said to refer to people in general, are male. When women are included in a speaker's reference, they are mentioned explicitly. E. Women are associated with evil. Women are also speakers of language. If most of the world's languages are patriarchal, their grammars written by men, their standard dialects controlled by men, and men's perceptions reflected in their structural properties, I must ask, why have women allowed men to control language so thoroughly for so long? Why have women accepted men's descriptions of the world as true? What is women's relationship to the patriarchal universe of discourse, PUD, if it describes men's perceptions? Are we to assume, with most of the men who've written on the subject, that what I'm calling the patriarchal universe of discourse is the only version of reality, and that women perceive and think exactly as men do? That is, that man-made languages adequately describe women's perceptions? Or is Susan Grimsdale's 1988 analysis of the situation in her Summary of Man-Made Language 1980 by Dale Spender more accurate? Do women pretend to agree with men's descriptions, going along with them in order to survive? Quote, "It could be said that women collude in the perpetuation of sexism in language. True, but we have had little choice. If women are to survive, we often feel we have to curry men's favor, make ourselves attractive to them, play the game, act the part, and most definitely avoid antagonizing them. Part of our task in pleasing men is for us to give reality to their definitions of words they associate with us. We modify our faces and our bodies, even in some cases going so far as to have surgery, all to comply with what they have defined as attractive and feminine. What else can we do? We please them in order to get our daily bread." If Grimsdale's suggestions are accurate, we are in a grim situation. Can it be that women collude in perpetuating their oppression, linguistic and otherwise, to get their daily bread from men? Women have had choices, must have, at some now unknowable stage of history. I don't agree with Susan Grimsdale's claim that we have had little choice, that women have colluded with men in order to get our daily bread. That description acknowledges male dominance without considering women's role in nurturing and maintaining patriarchy. What's more, I don't think Grimsdale really believed it either. Quote, "We need more new words, words that express the reality of women's abilities, that convey women's potential strength and autonomy. We must escape from the language trap that has male as norm, woman as deviant." If we have choices now, women before us have also had them. What did Grimsdale imagine the reality of women's abilities to be? She described strength and autonomy as merely potential, without explaining how new words for our abilities will enable us to escape the language trap. New ideas generally require new words, but first those ideas must be conceived. Is there a way out of this conundrum? Yes, but like any run for freedom, it will be dangerous and there will be losses. If women have colluded with men in their own oppression, then we must stop nurturing our oppressors and recognize that men are oppressors, that our oppression as women is not an accident, but systematic and purposeful, and will not end until we do what we must do to free ourselves. These are difficult decisions. Yet, one of the crucial ways of ending our oppression must lie in thinking ourselves free. Yes, new words will help, but only if we perceive ourselves in new ways. New words for the same old shit won't move us toward radical change in our lives. Language is action, not yet another accident that we cannot hope to change. When we speak, we are acting in the world. We make choices. Andrea Dworkin knows that our survival depends upon recognizing how words are central to our oppression and to the possibility of freedom. Quote, "Words matter because words significantly determine what we know and what we do. Words change us or keep us the same. Women, deprived of a forum for words, are deprived of the power necessary to ensure both survival and well-being." 1988. Men know this, which is why they repeatedly assure us that a good woman is a silent woman. A woman without words for her experience isn't acting in the world, that is, their world. Women who speak and write and think in non-patriarchal ways will change the world and reclaim it from male domination. Men resist our efforts to change language because they know that language change indicates both social and cognitive changes. In fact, though, PUD is so flexible that it can absorb and assimilate even radical ideas by turning them to its own purposes, and the media have shown an obstinate talent for recontextualizing and thereby distorting various elements of feminist politics. In the made-for-television movie The Billionaire Boys Club, 1989, one of the rich white men used the phrase consciousness-raising to describe his changed perception of what the club was doing when he saw the body of one of the men his friends had murdered. All the women who participated in consciousness-raising groups in the 1960s and 70s, the word referred very specifically and exclusively to the resulting process of change in how we perceived ourselves, our situation in the world, and our relationship to men. For us, consciousness-raising was a profound, mind-altering experience that impelled us to change our lives. We couldn't have imagined that that word would be so perverted as to end up describing a yuppie's shocked repulsion when he saw his first dead body. We must understand that changing language is an act of rebellion that signals the end of our collusion against ourselves with men, and we must ask ourselves how serious we are about ending female submission to male domination. Women have been fighting male control of English for several generations now, and we haven't made much headway against their entrenched resistance. We may fail, they may succeed in gradually distorting, corrupting, and diluting everything we still call feminism. Or we may fail and fail and fail, and eventually succeed. But we won't know unless we're willing to fail and unwilling to give up. New women, new world. I know that readers will find some parts of Speaking Freely difficult at first. Unlike psychology, sociology, and history, linguistics isn't general knowledge. When most people hear the word linguist, they think of someone who speaks a lot of languages. This is the popular misconception. Linguists study the structural properties of language and how language structure reflects conceptual structure. Although linguists often know several languages, both endeavors are more abstract than speaking a language generally suggests. I'm aware of the lack of familiarity with linguistics and its terminology, and I've tried wherever I could to avoid using unfamiliar terms. This wasn't always possible. There are some aspects of English for which there is no conventional vocabulary, e.g., psych predicates, and others for which linguistics has supplied a more precise characterization, e.g., agent and topic, instead of subject. In every situation, I've weighed both familiarity and precision against my major purpose, to get this information about English to women, to show other women how white men use English to keep our bodies and spirits domesticated and our minds away from dangerous questions. I've endeavored to explain the structural properties of English to an audience I imagine to be resistant to any grammar talk whatsoever, and therefore unprepared to explore the inner workings of something we can't reach out and touch, our internalized knowledge of the English language. I undertook this project because understanding the structure of English has helped me to unlearn many of the distortions and lies I believed for half my life. I have devoted more than 20 years to studying English and figuring out how it works and why it is as it is. Understanding how speakers can use English to befuddle, manipulate, coerce, or lie is important, and I think my analysis clarifies some of the ways the language works to maintain male domination and, as corollary, women's subordination. I believe that my readers will find the information in Speaking Freely not only useful, but important to them in changing their lives. And I have described some of the ways English plays a crucial role in women's socialization to powerlessness. I didn't set out to write a grammar book in any conventional sense, yet I have had to use grammatical terms to describe the structural properties of English in a consistent, comprehensible way. I know that many readers may be put off at first by the terminology, but I ask you to bear with me. My analysis of PUD required both grammatical concepts and their names, and linguistic terminology allowed me to talk about structures that prescriptive grammarians overlooked. Wherever possible, I have tried to avoid relying on jargon, but I have also had to have names for the characteristics of English I talk about. I've included a glossary at the end of the book as an aid for readers, and defined there the labels I use in the text. Our will to change must be founded in a comfortable self-consciousness. In Language in Woman's Place, 1975, R. Lakoff predicted that feminist attempts to change pronoun usage would be futile because the pronoun system is less open to change and speakers would resist any changes that made them self-conscious while they speak. Quote, I think one should force oneself to be realistic. Certain aspects of language are available to the native speaker's conscious analysis, and others are too common, too thoroughly mixed throughout the language for the speaker to be aware each time he uses them. It is realistic to hope to change only those linguistic uses of which speakers themselves can be made aware, as they use them. One chooses in speaking and writing more or less consciously and purposefully among nouns, adjectives, and verbs. One does not choose among pronouns in the same way. My emphasis of he. Her argument rests on the notion that any changes which require speakers to think before we speak will never replace androcentric elements of English, because no one wants to be self-conscious about what they say. Rejecting specific changes by assuming that self-consciousness about some linguistic choices, but not others, is too hard or impossible is obtuse as well as vague. Lakoff readily admitted that her training as a linguist may have dulled her perception regarding what she called neutral he, but I suspect that her early training in the rules of prescriptive grammar dulled her linguistic sensibilities, because the pronoun he is used pseudo-generically only in contexts where people are self-conscious about what they say. In casual conversation, most English speakers use they, not he, when referring to people in general, and I don't know why Lakoff failed to mention this fact. It is well known among linguists. In U.S. society, being made self-conscious about something is treated as negative, undesirable, to be avoided whenever possible, as though anything that interrupts the flow of what we consider natural, normal, or inherent hinders our ability to function. English speakers need more, not less, self-consciousness about what we say. Being aware of the cognitive significance and social ramifications of the linguistic choices we make is both necessary and constructive, because it ensures that we won't accept misogynistic language as normal. Self-consciousness guarantees that we don't remain locked in the biased descriptions of what PUD regards as the norm. Just as whites should be aware of the color of our skin and the able-bodied should be conscious of their mobility, all of us should choose the words and structures we use consciously. Pausing and weighing the words we choose to describe what we perceive and feel is essential to unlearning the rules of PUD and discovering people and the world without the male descriptions through which our thoughts have been filtered for years. Furthermore, R. Lakoff's argument makes language users passive rather than active. All speakers of English need to develop awareness of our linguistic agency as speakers and as listeners. Listening and reading aren't the passive activities we believe them to be. The sentences speakers use to describe people, objects, and events structure our interpretive processes as much as the words they choose. In the patriarchal universe of discourse, speakers show preferences for some syntactic structures over others, just as they prefer specific words to other, equally accurate ones. Learning to identify such structures and not be taken in by them is a crucial stage in the process of freeing our thinking from PUD descriptions, because the structure of sentences packages information the way speakers want us to understand it. We learn to think of speaking and writing as active language use, and of listening and reading as passive. Linguistic passivity is forced on women. Our earliest lessons as speakers tell us that our proper role is to listen to men brag about themselves and to speak softly, if at all. An important aspect of rethinking English and our use of it is empowering ourselves both as speakers and listeners. We will unlearn the insulting, degrading perspective of PUD as soon as we realize that English provides a map of only one version of reality, the male perspective, and omits other, equally viable perspectives. Women listen far more than we speak, and when we do talk, use our conversational skills encouraging men to occupy more discourse space. This learned passivity makes us susceptible to subliminal messages, not what is said so much as what is not said. The implicit messages we supply ourselves as we process sentences conceptually. We need to think of ourselves as linguistically powerful, as agents of language acts in our roles as listener and speaker. When we use language, our minds must be constantly engaged, whether we are conscious of it or not. The linguistic processes readers and listeners perform as participants include, but aren't limited to, supplying words and phrases missing from texts as a result of obligatory or optional omissions, making connections between words that affect textual cohesion, and resolving ambiguities when the writer or speaker does not. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, I analyze some of the syntactic processes speakers employ to create the structures we interpret, and my discussion focuses on how syntax functions in patriarchal rhetoric. From that point on, I am as concerned with what speakers leave out as what they actually say, and how listeners and readers use structural cues to guess at suppressed information. The purpose of my analysis is to show readers how to be self-conscious about their linguistic activities. When we are involved, as listeners or readers, in the creation of a text, we are conscious of what we're doing only in unusual circumstances, when we have trouble interpreting what we hear or read. I want to provide information so that women can engage in communication more consciously. Whether we are speaking or listening, writing or reading, being conscious of the functions of linguistic structures when we try to communicate or interpret someone else's utterance enables us to identify immediately and in context uses of language that are dishonest, misleading, or manipulative. If we are conscious of such linguistic tactics, we are less likely to accept incomplete or distorted descriptions as accurate or to allow speakers and writers to persuade us to think the way they would like us to think. Conscious knowledge is knowledge immediately available during reading or listening, and it gives us the means to change our own linguistic habits and defend ourselves when language is used against us. If we are to protect ourselves against insidious uses of English, we have to be able to identify such uses and challenge them when someone tries to coerce us linguistically. If we don't understand the structures that serve PUD, we remain the linguistic victims of male rhetoric. Unnamed experience remains unrecognized and inchoate. For those who accept male descriptions of reality, ignorance is truly bliss. But for those of us who seek a better world and more enlightened ways of living in it, understanding the role of language in perpetuating male dominance is crucial. In Chapter 11, I return to the importance of developing linguistic self-consciousness and its role in changing the way we think and our political circumstances. Women spend our lives as victims of male violence. Some of us realize this. What most are not aware of is the function of language in perpetuating our subordination and victimization. The patriarchal universe of discourse is made up of men's descriptions of what they perceive and what they name as real or unreal, important or insignificant, natural or unnatural, good or bad. Men have succeeded in convincing themselves and a majority of women that their descriptions are true and accurate. PUD is accepted as consensus reality, those collections of descriptions that most people use to interpret and understand themselves and the world around them. We are raised to think and live on the basis of how these descriptions present what life is like and what the world is like to our young minds. Gradually knowing nothing else, having been told nothing else, we believe them. Whatever perceptions we might have had recede into forgetfulness. When our experience contradicts what we have been told to believe the world is like, our identity, our sense of self, is endangered. Girls raped by their fathers and other male relatives, women beaten and raped by their husbands, and lesbians all know what happens in our minds when our experience contradicts the version of reality presented to us. We can decide that consensus reality is still true and label our own experience unique, personal, contrary to fact. We can deny, say whatever men did to us didn't happen, and suppress the information. Or we miraculously, against everything we've been taught, accept the validity of our knowledge. If we identify our experience as personal or deny it, we may live out our lives hiding our secret, certain that its discovery will mean our destruction. If we trust our own perceptions and ability to interpret experience for ourselves, we become intensely protective of our knowledge. Whichever way we choose to deal with our experiences, we believe three things. 1. That we're the only ones. 2. That the experience was the result of our own failure. 3. That we're alone in the world. We are either alienated from ourselves or from the society that lies to us. Whichever, our minds strive to reconcile these contradictions between the world described by PUD and our experiences in that world, and try to make sense of them. The psychiatric establishment calls denying and mistrusting ourselves, putting aside or suppressing our contradictory knowledge, adjusting. Those of us who refuse to adjust to the demands of patriarchy are labeled crazy, misfits, malcontents, freaks. Those who keep their secret pretend to adjust, believing inside that they're crazy. Some pretend to adjust, others don't. That is the only difference. Each of us believes that failure is personal. When we know that what we're told is lies, we strain the limits of our creativity, coming up with theories that will explain, to our satisfaction, the seemingly irreconcilable contradictions between what we've been told and believed to what our lives, our bodies, our brains have learned. These explanations, however, are monotonously few and rarely venture beyond the conceptual boundaries of PUD. Because male descriptions are all we know, our theories are grounded on what men tell us life is like. The raped daughter believes that her father's violence was her fault, that she seduced him, that she was bad, that she deserved to be raped. The beaten wife believes that her husband's violence was her fault, that she wasn't a good wife, that she caused his violence, that she deserved to be beaten. The lesbian believes that loving women is her fault, that there is something terribly wrong with her, that she deserves the mockery, ridicule, and violence men directed her. PUD demands that women limit our love to men, and our inability to find men lovable brands us as outcasts. Failure is personal. PUD supplies our imaginations with male perceptions of us. We are carnal, evil, wicked. So strong are male descriptions of the world that we never think to blame them. We believe what they tell us, that we are responsible for what they do to us. Men describe themselves as the victims of our treachery, our betrayal, and we believe that we are the guilty ones. Our minds do the work of patriarchy. We believe that we are the evildoers in our explanations, and that message etches paths in our minds, paths that are nothing so much as the tracks wild animals wear around the peripheries of their cages at the boundaries of their lives. Failure is personal. In order to go on believing men's lies, we blame ourselves, we blame circumstances, we blame their working conditions, the weather, where we live, where we do not live. Women spend their lives making up excuses for men, who they are, and not what they do to us. Always we blame ourselves. My assumptions. I've written Speaking Freely because I want to change the world. When I talk about structures in the English language as pieces of the patriarchal universe of discourse that coerce us to perceive ourselves as participants in that universe, I'm assuming that the prevailing descriptions of the world are inaccurate, and that the world so described is not the best of all possible worlds. I'm assuming that we want a better world to live in, one in which each of us is valued for who we are, not devalued because we fail to fit the idea of someone else thinks we ought to be. I'm assuming that we're capable of unlearning patriarchal assumptions and values, and are equally capable of creating different descriptions of the world. and I'm assuming that understanding the ways English perpetuates patriarchal descriptions initiates these changes. Yes, the syntax and semantics of languages encode experiences of the world, but my analysis indicates that these experiences aren't women's experiences, and that the experiences described by English are those of men, who have controlled the development and grammatical explanations of English up to this time. The English language facilitates the expression of patriarchy's preferred and validated perceptions and experiences. Consider, for example, the phrase, to lower standards, as in, if we admit women, African Americans, Native Americans, Chicanos, Latinos, and members of other oppressed groups, we'll be forced to lower our standards. Now, this description may seem harmless enough. We might shrug it off as yet another example of the white male perspective at work. It is certainly a white male description, but it's far from merely innocuous. The plural pronoun our in this case is intended to refer to all the members of a particular college or university, or more generally to all members of academia. In fact, this statement is always made by a white man. Listed below are the presuppositions of PUD that we accept if we believe lower in this description makes sense. 1. It implies a change in position with respect to an earlier position in time with respect to an unspecified but implied judgment. 2. It implies that the standards were, at an earlier time, higher with respect to the position that they might come to occupy if women, African Americans, and others gain entry. 3. Because low equals worse, the projected change in position and standards will by definition be worse. 4. Therefore, change is bad. But we don't know what the previous standards were. We don't know what the implied measure by which the relative position of the standards is, or the basis of the unspecified judgment. We have no idea how high the implied higher was. Change can be good, bad, or indifferent. Usually, how a specific change is judged depends on whether the individual making the judgment will benefit from it. In addition, the verb lower implies human agency to enact what it describes, and that agency must be voluntary, which implies that white men could refuse to act. Why don't they? Because they know their description is a sham? What purposes are served when white men talk about lowering their standards? They're avoiding saying something else that would expose their real reasons for resisting change. The change itself, admitting women and men of various ethnic and racial groups, will alter the nature of the student body, the content of courses, and ways of teaching and grading. The previously white male student body was more homogeneous. As a result, the criteria for grading were clearer and easier. As long as students were predominantly male and white, the variables that determined grading were simpler. They were variables established and controlled by the admissions process. Teachers could assume their students had a certain level of social and economic privilege, otherwise they wouldn't have been admitted. Given the assumption of class privilege, a student who performed poorly could be dismissed as a slackard who preferred partying to studying. There were few other acceptable excuses. Once, however, women and minority men, except for Asian students who outperform white students so convincingly that a different tactic has to be found and kept secret, gain entry to academia, the grading process becomes much more complicated because students are no longer homogeneous. The criteria for grading, what is acceptable performance, are broadened because teachers now have to consider additional variables, and their previous assumptions must be questioned, examined, and tested. A student body of individuals who come from a wide range of economic, racial, and ethnic backgrounds introduces ambiguity into teaching, and jokes about women, N-words, and S-words that always got a laugh have to be deleted from lecture notes. That one little phrase, lowering our standards, is easier than making explicit everything that it hides and opening up the workings of academia to scrutiny. If we choose to accept the terms of PUD and the assertions that rationalize white male dominance, it is difficult, but not impossible, to describe the world in heterodox ways. I'm assuming that we must know which aspects of English structure are perceptual and conceptual traps, and that learning to avoid such traps will impel us to discover the descriptions that will enable us to reconceive the world and ourselves as active agents in the world. In the chapters to follow, I describe several of the linguistic ways men perpetuate their dominance: abstraction that refuses to be explicit about events in the world, attribution of agentive status to abstract or inanimate objects, the suppression of human agency and responsibility for events and acts in the world, inaccurate or distorted descriptions that claim to be true statements about the world, an interlocking system of metaphorical concepts that emphasizes only selected aspects of events, objects, and people, and hides other equally significant features of our experience in the world, even from us. This is not a book about non-sexist writing. It is a book about how patriarchal thought controls and limits the ways we live in the world. An analysis of how the structure of English developed to perpetuate men's descriptions of what our lives are like and what the world is like. I want to understand and live in another world than the one men have made, and I hope other women will join me in its recreation.